A reading from the Gospel according to Matthew. Then the kingdom of heaven will be like this. 10 bridesmaids took their lamps and went to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish, and 5 were wise. When the foolish took their lamps, they took no oil with them, but the wise took flasks of oil with their lamps. As the bridegroom was delayed, all of them became drowsy and slept. But at midnight there was a shout, "Look, here's the bridegroom, come out to meet him." Then all those bridesmaids got up and trimmed their lamps. The foolish said to the wise, "Give us some of your oil, for our lamps are going out." But the wise replied, "No, there will not be enough for you and for us. You'd better go to the dealers and buy some for yourselves." And while they went to buy it, the bridegroom came, and those who were ready went in with him into the wedding banquet, and the door was shut. Later the other bridesmaids came also, saying, "Lord, Lord, open to us." But he replied, "Truly I tell you, I do not know you. Keep awake, therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour."
I've been around long enough to know that not everybody finds cartoons of the New Yorker magazine funny, which is why I'm always a bit ambivalent about using one to begin a sermon, because there's nothing worse than telling a joke standing here and none of you laughing. It's a lonely, lonely feeling. But there's a New Yorker cartoon about the end of the world that I'm going to risk this morning because it is so much to do with our parable for today. Our 8 o'clock crowd laughed heartily at it. I'm sure our C2 service meeting right now watching me by film will laugh heartily at it. So let us hope you will as well. The cartoon goes as follows. It's a busy city intersection. All the traffic lanes are clogged. Chimneys in the distance are belching this black smoke, and pedestrians are seemingly oblivious to one another as they pass each other on this busy street. It's a dreary, stark scene. You with me? On one corner of this busy intersection is your classic prophet of doom, and he's holding his placard proudly. He's dressed in this long, scruffy white robe. He's wearing sandals, and he has a full, unkempt beard. His placard reads, good news, the world is coming to an end." We're not there yet. Directly across the street from this prophet of doom, there's another prophet who looks identical to the first. He too is wearing a long white robe. He too has a beard. He too looks unkempt. And he too is holding a placard. But this prophet's placard has a different message. It reads, bad news, the world is not coming to an end. You're going to have to cope. That's the joke. Now, as I said, not everyone finds the cartoons of the New Yorker magazine funny, but this one tickles me, I guess, because it is, I would suggest, a nice little summary of what is a perennial Christian dilemma, which is simply this. What about all of this end of the world business? For whether by a roar or a whimper, we are told that the world will end. With earthquakes and climate change and Ebola and economic chaos and wars and terrorism being examples, some people say, as proof that the end of the world is near. But then why should we be surprised? I mean, why should we be surprised? For we see the signs of this wide-ranging debate on this very issue as far back as the original writings of our Holy Scriptures. In fact, the Apostle Paul seems to have expected Jesus to return in a few months, which is why the gospel lessons, written some 30 to 60 years after Paul wrote, were already having to interpret why there'd been such a delay, why Christ had not come yet. And by the time Matthew's gospel, which we read from this morning, was written somewhere around 80 AD, it was becoming quite clear that this world, despite what Paul had said, might go on for a long, long, long time. And so the followers of Christ, well, those who were followers of Christ were murmuring a bit. They're wondering why Christ had not returned. Why is it taking so long? They've given up everything to follow him. Let's get on with the program. And worse yet, they're wondering now how they're going to live in the meantime. How they're going to live now that Christ's return doesn't seem imminent. Now, of course, periodically over the millennia, Christians have thought about this topic. They've studied their scriptures, and some have even tried to predict the end of the world. And this has led, as you know, to some pretty wacky outcomes, right? I mean, at regular intervals, personages no less august than popes, no less informed than scientists like Isaac Newton, for example, and no less sincere than simple, devoted folks have all tried predicting the end of the world. Sometimes homes have been sold, possessions have been given away in anticipation of the end. In fact, whole denominations were begun with this shared belief on a fixed end date. And of course, our modern culture's interest in the end of all things has resulted in the best-selling book phenomenon called the Left Behind series. You read it? This series where the authors, having parlayed their interest and our interest in the matter of the end of the world, into $1 million empire now. Of course, one wonders when the world ends what they're going to do with all that money. But unfortunately, the truth is, most modern authors' predicted end of the world offers us a pretty angry, militant Christ, don't they? It's a Christ who comes back to earth to rescue the faithful in a rapture. This Christ does away with the opposition, and the end of the world as we know it is ushered in with this new age. In fact, theologians have studied this new series, and they've analyzed every possible proposed end-time scenario, and they've categorized this Left Behind series scenario in a theological way like this. It is Christian dispensational premillennialism. Fortunately, that's not a very catchy slogan for a placard, is it? So you're not going to see anyone marching around on a corner with it, but so what does Christian dispensational premillennialism actually mean? Well, it basically boils down to what our first prophet of doom, which I described to you in the New Yorker cartoon a minute ago, was saying. It means good news, the world is coming to an end. But you know, interestingly enough, I don't think this Left Behind scenario of the end of the world is what this parable of Jesus from Matthew's gospel is telling us about the end of the world. Because if you had to put the message of this little story of the 10 bridesmaids and their oil lamps on a placard, I would suggest that message would be more like the second prophet's placard in the New Yorker cartoon, because what Jesus describes in our lesson for today comes closer to saying the world's not coming to an end, so you're going to have to cope. In fact, if you read through the entire 24th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew, not right now, but later, and you read the first part of the 25th chapter, you'll find that Jesus says the same thing 5 times in 5 different ways. The same message. And what is the message? The message is that Christ will return, but when we least expect it. And no one knows when that will be. No one knows when. No one knows. No one. And so this return of the kingdom of heaven to earth, of peace and compassion and understanding and forgiveness and love, And so those of us who believe in that return as Christ's followers, we are expected to live with uncertainty. Or to put it another way, we are all going to have to learn how to cope. Now, in our text for today, Jesus chooses to use a traditional Palestinian wedding feast as an allegory. I don't know how many of you have been to Palestinian weddings over the last few weeks. But let me explain it to you. See, in Jesus' time, the exact time of an upcoming wedding was kept a secret so that it could be a surprise and be anticipated with just that much more excitement. And so the bridesmaids who were chosen sat with the bride, and they waited for the bridegroom to arrive, and the groomsmen would try to sneak up on the bridesmaids and surprise them, shouting, "Behold, the bridegroom comes! Good news, good news!" Then the bridesmaids would light their lamps, and they would escort everybody into the banquet hall. After that, the door would be shut, and if you failed to be there to go in with the group, if you hadn't been at your post, if you hadn't been ready, if you hadn't been waiting, then you missed the big event. Of course, you see, the original hearers of this parable back in 80 AD, is to them, this parable is being told, and they would have understood this. They would have understood this parable of the 10 bridesmaids. 5 he calls wise, and 5 he calls foolish. The wise ones bring an extra flask of oil for their lamps, ready for the wait. The foolish bring only their lamps, and they run out of oil before the bridegroom even comes. So the foolish bridesmaids head off to town. They're going to buy more oil, and they're not present and waiting when the bridegroom finally arrives, and they miss the party. Now, I would suggest what Jesus is driving at in his allegory here is something we probably can see clearly, right? He is the bridegroom who'll be arriving on an unannounced schedule. We, the church, are the bridesmaids. We will either be wise or foolish. And I would suggest to you that distinction between wisdom and foolishness, that distinction, that's the point of the parable. Are we going to be wise in the way we wait for Christ as we live into this world? Or are we going to be foolish as we wait for Christ as we live into this world? And what exactly would mark us as being one or the other? Well, apparently, if you read the story, wisdom or foolishness doesn't necessarily relate to perfect unyielding vigilance. Because if you notice in the story, the wise and the foolish bridesmaids both take a little nap, we're told, like some of you are doing right now as they waited. So it seems to be, I saw you. Yeah. It seems to be okay to rest. It's okay to rest and to be confident as we wait for the fulfillment of God's promise. For virtue doesn't come in hyperactivity, you see, over what lies ahead. Rather, at least according to the parable, virtue and wisdom, this parable tells us, comes in waiting well. Waiting well. You know, I got to tell you, as an A-type personality, an ENFP on the Myers-Briggs, a 2 on the Enneagram, I hate that wisdom. But that's the message of the parable. It's all about how we wait. And let's face it, John Claypool says, there are 2 kinds of reality in this world of ours. There's those things you have to work for, and there are those things you have to wait for. And most of us would rather work than wait, wouldn't we? For waiting makes us feel ineffectual. It makes us feel uninspired. We feel idle. We feel passive, and we're so often in a hurry. But apparently, at least according to Jesus here, God is going to work on God's time, not on our time. So, given the truth of this parable, it may be wise to wonder if maybe then, just maybe, waiting on things in this life serves a purpose. Waiting just may be a divine, sacred, holy, and powerful thing. Casey and I were both fortunate enough during our doctoral studies to work under the tutelage of Dr. Jonathan Morgan. Morgan's a professor of history and philosophy at the Graduate Theological Foundation in South Bend, and I might add, not particularly prone to sentimentality. I saw him smile once. And so an event that he recounted as we met in our cohort group one day seems all the more significant to me. In the middle of the night, Morgan says, the phone rang. And what parent doesn't know the terror of that middle of the night ring? This call was from my son-in-law calling to say that my daughter, Bethany, had just arrived at the hospital in labor and was preparing to deliver what would be my first grandchild. Morgan goes on to say, unfortunately, and I didn't know quite what to do, so in pre-grandparent time, my wife and I got dressed. We navigated the snowy roads of South Bend, Indiana, and we arrived at the hospital full of excitement and anticipation. He says they went straight to Bethany's birthing room, where between contractions they gave her a kiss and a word of encouragement, and then they stepped outside the room to wait. The nurse, Nurse Ratchet he called her, the nurse suggested pointedly that they would surely prefer to be in the waiting room, which was just down the hall. She said they could relax better there, be more comfortable. They could grab a cup of coffee. But Morgan says, I knew I couldn't be that far away from Bethany. So we asked if we could just stand outside the door and wait. Well, at first, Nurse Ratchet seemed caught off guard by the request. But then she said that if we would stay out of the way, she supposed it would be all right. So, for the next 7 hours, that's what Morgan and his wife did. In 2 folding chairs requisitioned from the storage room, they simply sat outside the door and they waited, never leaving their position. He said that the traffic in and out of the room was like the Holland Tunnel at rush hour. There were doctors and nurses and technicians. They came and went, but they stayed out of the way. Every so often, Morgan said, we could hear the cry of our daughter, managing the contractions, so painful and constant. And I knew that cry, he said. I'd heard it when she was young, when she had a bad dream, when her stomach hurt, when she had fallen and scraped her knee. And I could go to her when she cried like that, but I couldn't go this time. It was, Morgan said, perhaps the hardest thing I've had to do, to just sit outside that door and wait, unable to comfort my child, unable to hold my daughter, unable to do much of anything useful. And then, said Morgan, after what seemed an interminable wait, the cries of my daughter ceased, and quiet prevailed, utter quiet. And then there was a new cry, one I had not yet heard, but had waited for such a long time. And my grandson was born. And at that moment, he said, the stiff back, the sleepless night, the anxiety, the long wait, none of it mattered when I heard that cry. And then he said with tears in his eyes, and here's what's interesting. To this day, to this very day, when this life seems to be getting the better of me, when I feel down and frustrated, perhaps a bit jaundiced about the world, it's that memory of the cry of my grandson at birth that becomes a hymn of reassurance to me. Soothing, comforting, full of hope and possibility. And I am changed, he said. That cry changed me, and it was all worth the wait. That's the point of this parable, I think. It reminds us that waiting for Christ's kingdom is worth the wait. And I would even go so far as to say that all the other things we wait for in this life, they prepare us for that ultimate wait, because we all wait for something, don't we? Whether we're waiting for a relationship to be restored, or a health issue to be resolved, or financial problems to be redone, or a loss to heal, or an answer to be known, we all wait for something, don't we? So what are you waiting for today? Whatever it is, listen to me. Today's parable teaches us that your waiting is important, fallow time. It's sacred time. It's holy time. It's a time when you are becoming more and more and more of who you are. And you're being made ready for what's ahead. And Jesus' parable for today simply asks you to ponder only one question. Will wisdom or foolishness be your destiny as you wait? For Samuel Massey has so brilliantly said, maybe, just maybe, the greatest mistake these foolish bridesmaids made was not necessarily to run out of oil. Maybe really the big mistake is that they lost interest in the end goal. They decided they couldn't hang in there. They decided they had to run away and try to find some more oil again. And they failed to make it. They failed to wait. They failed to fulfill their mission. Because better to have stayed, even without the lamp oil, than to lose track of what really mattered, the wedding. And in so doing, they miss a truly great event to which they could have contributed. And Jesus calls that foolish. How did the text put it? Those that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. Yes, the two prophets from the New Yorker cartoon were probably very well-intentioned souls. And I thank you for your laugh. But neither of their placards had it quite right, you see. Rather, each had a part of the truth from Jesus' parable today. For maybe if we could condense the gospel for today's message into one placard, it would sound something like this. Good news, good news. The world's not coming to an end, but through Christ, we have all we need for the wait. So let's keep our lamps trimmed, and as we do, for God's sake, let's keep them burning. Amen.